We're thankful for the public prayer that's been offered, and we ask that you continue to pray this morning. I'd like to read to you, takes our text this morning, Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1. Hebrews 12, the very first verse. Wherefore, seeing we are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. Here in this verse, the Apostle Paul is making a parallel to our life here on this earth to a race. Now, I am sure if the Apostle Paul was preaching today, there would be some complaint that he has all these examples as talking about sports. Well, I'm going to talk about running this morning, but I have a good example. The Apostle Paul did it, and so I'm going to do it. And I'm going to mainly go by what Paul said in the Word of God, but also throw in a few examples that we might understand this. You know, the Apostle Paul had also said when he wrote the church at Philippi, and I believe this is in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 14, that he said, I press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. If you think about what Paul is saying, he says he's pressing for that mark. And here he is speaking of being in a race. And in a race, what you're doing is you're pressing toward that mark, aren't you? You have the finish line out in front of you, and you're pressing toward that finish line. You're running toward that. That's your goal. You have that goal set in front of you. Now, Paul also said about running, he said over in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 24, he says, Know ye not that they which run in a race run all, but one receiveth the prize. So run that ye may obtain. Now, let's be clear what Paul is talking about here in Corinthians. In fact, any of his illustrations that he has in the scriptures about running is not a race to make sure that you get to heaven. That's not at all what's under consideration. Paul knows that our eternal salvation is all in the Lord's hand. It's all been taken care of. Paul is writing this letter. In fact, all of these letters that I read to you from this morning, he wrote all of these letters to churches and to individuals that he was convinced that were already saved eternally. So he is writing this letter and making this example for us here in our walk today. And he said our life here today is like a race. Now, he made that statement that only one receives a prize. Now, what's Paul trying to get across to us when he's saying that all run a race, but there's only one person that finishes first? They get the prize. Well, let me illustrate it this way. Let's say perhaps that we're going to have a race, and there's 1,000 people running the race. And the person that finishes first gets a prize of $1,000. And everybody else gets nothing. So if you was in that race, and you were running there and you was getting close to the finish line, and you were just a few feet behind the first place runner, and you knew in your mind that if I finish first, I get $1,000. If I finish second, I get $0. And would your mindset be, well, second place isn't too bad. There'll be 998 people that I beat, so second place isn't too bad. I'll just settle for second place. If you're running, you ain't going to do that, especially if you're greedy. You know, You're going to give everything that you have to finish first, aren't you? So that's the thought that Paul wants us to have as we go throughout this race that we call life. He's wanting us to give everything that we have. Just like that we're only going to be one prize given. He wants us to live our life in total service to Him, giving it all to the Lord. That's what Paul is saying. Now let's think about this race. And I want to go back again to where we began over in Hebrews. But I want us to consider something. If you noticed when I read that 12th verse, 12th chapter, verse 1, did you notice what the very first word of that chapter was? Wherefore. You know what that means? Paul had talked about something in chapter 11, but he wasn't through yet. He wasn't through. He's wanting to now apply it. And so what he is doing here in Hebrews chapter 12, he's applying something for our benefit that will work and help us in our life, that's based on some theology that he gave us back over in chapter 11. Now in chapter 11 of Hebrews, chapter 11 is that great list of all of those people who showed such great faith. Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, on and on it goes. Moses. All of these individuals, these godly people, walked in faith. Their faith was so great that they are mentioned now here in Hebrews chapter 11. And we call this the Hall of Faith. It's like a Hall of Fame of the Old Testament, those who showed great faith. But I want us to think about something as we read through the chapter 11 of Hebrews about all these people that had such great faith. Why was it that they had such great faith? What was so important to them that they could go through all kinds of difficulties and never waver in their faith? Well, maybe a little bit of waver, but overcome that little bit of a waver. If you think about all of these things they went through, take, for example, one of the people that's mentioned in Joseph. And we know that Joseph, all that he went through, he was hated by his brothers. They wanted to kill him, but they ended up selling him as a slave. And then as a slave, he was accused of a crime that he didn't commit, and he was thrown into prison unjustly. I mean, he went through all things, and you know how much Joseph's faith wavered through all those years? Not a bit. How is it that Joseph and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all of these that are mentioned here in Hebrews chapter 11, how is it that they could have such strong, unwavering faith and continue on in service to God? Now I want to point out a couple of verses here in Hebrews chapter 11. And if you look in verse 13, after mentioning Abraham and Noah and Sarah and Enoch and Abel, here's what Paul wrote in verse 13. He says, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Verse 16, but now they desire a better country, that is, an heavenly. Now, think about what Paul has just written. All these men didn't receive in this life the end of their faith that they expected. But they all had something in common. They had that prize of the mark in front of them. That's what Paul mentioned back over in Philippians chapter 3. Here's what Paul is trying to get across to us. And now he's going to use it as we come down to Hebrews chapter 12. The reason that these people had such strong faith and could endure great afflictions, great persecutions, great trials, is because they had a heavenly focus. They were focused on, not on this life, but they were focused on their coming life in heaven. Do you realize that that is the only way that you and I can be strong in our faith here in this world and in this time? Is as we run this race, we must have a heavenly focus. That's our finish line. That's our goal that's set out before us. So let's look. We've got the finish line now. We've got the goal set out before us in this race. So we're going to be running till that mark. And our whole life should be a desire to run this race until we get to that point, that finish line. So now here we think about what Paul has said here in Hebrews chapter 12. He said that we are to lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and run with patience. Now I'll stop. First thing I want to point out about this race, it says patience. You know, when I was in school, I'm so old, we didn't have the 100-meter dash, we had the 100-yard dash. And I remember being in school when we ran the 100-yard dash, and when we lined up and started running, the coach had lots of things in mind, but patience wasn't one of them. He didn't want us to use any patience. We were supposed to give it our whole, everything that we had for that 100 yards. No patience at all. Run, run, run. Sprint as fast as you could from the start line to the finish line, 100 yards down the track. But Paul here says that our race that we're to run, we're to have patience. You know what that tells me? This race that we're running should be compared not to a 100-yard dash, but to a marathon. I haven't run a marathon. I've done a few half marathons. And yes, patience is needed. Patience is needed. It's kind of interesting. It's sometimes kind of funny. And some of the races that I have run, you'll get some little kids, you know, that don't know better. You know, they'll be, 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever their ages are. And we'll have say a 3-mile race to run. And so this little kid will start off at the start line, giving it everything that they've got. They'll just fly by me. And then about 100 yards down the course, they're just sitting there huffing and puffing about to die. And so I'll just in my slow running gait going past them. After they get rested up, here they'll come flying by me again. And then about 100 yards later, there they on the ground about to die. And so I'll just run right on by my nice, easy stride that I have. Now that may go on 5 or 6 times. Sometimes those kids finish the race, sometimes they don't. But the point is, they should have exercised some patience, because we have a marathon to run. And if you run in a marathon, if you start out full speed as fast as you can run, you're not going to get close to finishing it. You're going to run out. And spiritually, I've seen some people like that. I mean, I can name you some people that when they first started serving the Lord, everybody said, man, they are just on fire for the Lord. and then about 6 months later, the fire's been extinguished and you never see them again. You know, some people are like that. We need to be continuing on. Now, there's something else I want to mention to you about this marathon. If you look up in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 40, as Paul was closing out that chapter, and he didn't have the chapter breaks like we do, but he was closing out that thought, and he was referring back unto all of these Old Testament saints that he had just mentioned as having great faith. Notice he said something I think is very interesting. He said, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. So he is saying that those Old Testament saints were not perfect without us. Now that word perfect in the Scriptures means complete, mature and complete. So he's saying that the Old Testament saints, the race that they were running was not complete without us. So what this is telling me in our understanding as we try to describe this race that we're to run as followers of Jesus Christ, that this race that we're running is a relay. Now, y'all know what a relay is, don't you? You know, typically you'll see 4 individuals on the same team, and one of them will start off and run a fourth of the way and hand the baton to the second runner, and then that runner goes their fourth of the way, and then they'll give the baton and so on until all 4 of them have completed. Our race here needs to be kept in mind that it's just a relay. The reason I bring this up is when we're running this race as a follower of Christ, we don't need to get it in our mind that we are the it. You know, we're not the only one running the race. We're part of a team. We're all running this race together as part of a team. Do you know what happens in a track meet, in a relay race, when one member of that relay team drops the baton? They're disqualified. They're out. They have no chance of finishing. So often, when we're running this race here in our life, we think if we drop the baton in our life, that we're the only one that's affected. That's not true. What we do here in this life, here in this church, in our families, in our communities, what we do affects a whole bunch of people. We're not in this alone. We're all in this race together on the same team. Now, he said here in this race, he said that let us lay aside every weight. Now let me see if you think this sounds logical, okay? So, I go out in the month of September. This is September. And y'all see how the weather is out here. So I'm getting ready to run a half a marathon. I ran one time in September. So let me see if you think this is what I did when I got ready to run that half marathon in September. I put on all my running gear, my running shoes, my running shirt, my running hat, and then I put on my overcoat, and I put on 3 pairs of breeches, and I put a 5-pound weight on each leg and a 3-pound weight on each elbow. Does that sound logical? That sounds stupid, doesn't it? I mean, if you get that much weight, what chance do you have of winning a race or even doing well in a race compared to if you didn't have those weights? You don't stand a chance, do you? In fact, do you know that a lot of people train for races they train by having weights on their legs and they get used to running with those weights right above their shoes. And then so when it comes time for the race and they take those weights off and they start running, they feel like, they're so light that they're just floating. So they're just able to barrel down the track at full speed. Well, spiritually, we have some weights that beset us. And he's also said, here, it's very similar to it, he said, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so doth easily beset us. And all my life I've wanted to know what that sin was. What sin is it that so easily beset us? Some people say, and I see the logic of this to a certain extent, the sin which besets us is unbelief. And I think that's true. Unbelief bothers us so often that we don't believe all the promises of God. And perhaps some other things are included in there, but if you think about that, unbelief is a heading, and there's a whole bunch of other sins underneath it. Let's think of it that way. The sin that does so easily beset us is unbelief, but underneath it, here's a whole bunch of other sins that easily beset us. So what sin is it? I know what mine is. You know what yours is? We all have a particular sin, don't we? That is our problem. It can be a whole bunch of different things. Let me just throw out just a couple of them. Covetousness, idolatry, anger, wrath. Some of those I have a problem with. Some of them I don't. I'm not going to tell you which one I have a problem with. But anyway, there's a whole bunch of others. If you need help finding yours, I'll give you a hint. Read the Bible. And when you come across the word that says, oh, I have a problem with that, there it is. There's your sin and the way that besets you. So if we're going to run this race, what do we have to do? We have to set those weights aside. Now, it sounds real easy. I'll admit this. It's a lot easier said than done. Occasionally somebody will come to me with a particular issue that they have, and they know that it's wrong, and know it's ungodly, and say, I have this issue, and I just don't know what to do. You know what my almost universal advice is? Quit. That's easy, isn't it? Whatever your besetting sin is, whatever your weight is, just quit. Now, I realize that it's a lot harder to do it than just merely just say it. Let me do this. I'm going to give you some homework, and I'm just going to, I'll read it to you. Your homework is think about it, okay? I'd say that these weights that are common, you could also say that they are the works of the flesh. If you look in Galatians chapter 5, and you begin in verse 19, and you go down through a couple of verses, I'm going to read this real fast, but I don't want to take the time this morning to talk about unpleasant things. But go back and think about this. See, does any of these apply to you? He says the works of the flesh are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, revelings. That's enough bad stuff, isn't it? So, if you want some more, go read a little bit more. I don't know that any of those apply to you, but one thing I do know, we all have a sin that does easily beset us. We need to pray to the Lord that He would help us to lay aside that sin that besets us so that we can run with patience this race. When you begin to run a race, for this, let's say I'm getting ready this half marathon I ran one time. Do you think I just kind of signed up for that race and then didn't do anything, and at the morning of the race just rolled out of bed and said, I think I better go run that half marathon today? It don't work that way, does it? If you're going to run a race, you have some conditioning to do. There's so many miles I'd run every day. There's so many exercises that I would do. And there's also something that I would eat, make sure I didn't eat. I had to watch all kinds of things like that. Do you realize that spiritually it's exactly the same way? If we're going to run this race spiritually, there is some conditioning that we have to do. Now, the first thing you got to do is eat right. And Peter says over in 1 Peter, I think it's chapter 2 and verse 2 or 4, I can't remember. But Peter said that desire the sincere milk of the word that you may grow thereby. So the first thing that you're going to need to do if you're going to run this race as a Christian is to eat right. Let's see. We're going to eat the Christian's diet. All right, everybody's with me on that, right? So let's see where we can find it. You reckon we'll find it on HBO? Or one of those other ungodly channels on the telegarbage? You reckon we're going to find that down at the neighborhood bar? Where are we going to find the right diet to prepare for this race? Right here in the Word of God. Sometimes it amazes me that people think they can fight the world and argue for the truth of God without ever opening the Word of God itself. You know, I can't emphasize enough how important it is for us to be reading our Bibles daily. Daily. You say, well, I tried reading it, and I don't understand what I read. I want to confess something to you. Neither did I the first 50 times I read it. All right? Now, you say, you read it, it took you 50 times to read the Bible to understand anything? No. But there's some things I understood right away, but there's some things I've read 50 times and I still don't understand it completely. But the more you read it, the more times you go over and over it, the more you're going to understand it. And then if you read something and you don't understand it, what are you supposed to do? Go ask Brother Kenny. He's not here, so I can, you know. You go ask your pastor. You know, go ask him. He'll explain it to you. If he can't give you an answer, he can find one or tell you somebody you can talk to give you an answer to most things. Now, we all know, none of us totally understand, you know, the book of Revelation or the book of Daniel, some of those things. But the things that you need for your race, he can help you with if you can't understand it from reading the Word of God. I've got a chronological reading chart. I read through the Bible chronologically once a year. For several years, I read through the book of Proverbs every month. First day of the month, I'd read chapter 1. Second day of the month, I'd read chapter 2, and so on and so. So you get through the whole Bible 12 times, the whole book of Proverbs 12 times in a year. It's amazing how much more you'll understand about it with a little repetition. So there's some things that we need to eat if we're going to run this spiritual race. There's some conditioning that we have to do. In training for a race, you've got to go out and do some running. We need to do some spiritual training and spiritual running. What is that? Praying diligently is one of those things. Continuing to communicate with God. To walk in that spiritual path every day You know, the Bible teaches us that he who is faithful in the least will be faithful in that which is great. So we need to be faithful in the small things continually. Continue to exercise in those godly ways. There's something else that you notice here when he first started talking about it. In chapter 12 and verse 1, he said, seeing we are compassed about so great a cloud of witnesses. Have you ever seen a race? Well, you probably have. Let me rephrase that. Most races that I've been to had a crowd of people there. If you go watch a race at the Olympics, is there anybody watching that race? There's thousands of them there. Probably millions watching it on TV. Thousands and thousands of people watching it. All these witnesses to your race. Do you realize that the race that you're running today, you have witnesses? You have witnesses. Now that can be good or bad, can it? It could go either way. I mean, if we're not doing a very good job, you know, I've seen races when, you know, if you watch some of these comedy things, you know, the most common one is people going over hurdles and don't make it over the hurdle and end up doing somersault, break a leg or something like that. I mean, it's kind of painful, and I feel sorry for those people. But there's a lot of witnesses to that. In our spiritual race, let's don't trip over the hurdle. Let's go forward in running that race. You know, Paul said one thing, I think it's over in 2 Timothy, and he was speaking in this case about soldiers. And he was talking about that no man that warreth, I can't remember the exact wording of it, but no man that warreth is seeking after the things of flesh. What he's saying is that if you're a soldier in battle, you don't do that after you get off work at 5 o'clock. You know, if you're in battle, if you're in war, that's a full-time job, isn't it? I mean, would we want our military, you know, not clocking in to service until 8 a.m. and clocking out at 5 p.m. every day? Probably wouldn't be too successful, would they? How about you in your spiritual walk? Are you at it all the time? Continuing in this race? And it's easy to get distracted in this race. I was listening to a story earlier about a man that used to be on a track team, a high school track team. They were undefeated. Had the second fastest time in the state of Texas. They were probably going to win state in their size of classifications. They had won every race all year long. They had won the district track meet. They were at the regional track meet, and if they won that race, they go to the state track meet to run for the state title. As they run this relay, as the third leg was coming around with the baton and getting ready to hand it to the final runner, he looked back to see the runner behind him. You know what happened? He dropped the baton. Their season was over. Why? Because one of the runners got distracted. It's easy to get distracted in this world, isn't it? It's so easy. I mean, you can turn off your telegarbage, you can turn off the radio, you can turn off all the music, you can turn off everything, and just drive down the road going to work, and you get distracted, don't you? There's all kinds of distractions in this world. What we need to have is a focus upon the race that they're running. You know, I've seen tapes in the past of what was called the world's fastest human that had the fastest time in a 100-meter dash. I mean, you have to watch fast. I think he only took him 9 seconds or something like that to go that 100 meters. Do you think that as he was going down that race, running that 100 meters to win the race, that he'd look over in the crowd and see if he could see his mom and dad over there somewhere? No. Yeah, they're there. But we got to keep our eyes upon the goal. What is that goal? Heaven. Heaven. That's our finish line. Is heaven. We're going to be running this race as long as we're here in this world. And the reason that we can run it with faith, and the reason that we can have all that faith and overcome all kinds of obstacles and in the midst of difficulties and disappointments and trials in life, that we can keep on that straight and narrow path, is because we've got our eyes focused upon heaven, upon the Lord that's there. You know what Paul said? I've come to love Paul's second letter to Timothy, 2 Timothy, and you get over into 2 Timothy chapter 4, and what I've come to love about this chapter is that this was Paul's last letter that he wrote. So if you think about it, the last chapter of the last letter he wrote, don't you think he wrote some good stuff in there? This is the last that he was going to write under the inspiration of God. Notice what he says in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 6. He says, "For I am now ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand." He said, "I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course." Now, in light of what we looked at this morning, I'm going to say that was a race course. Okay? I finished my course. I have kept the faith. This race wasn't about Paul to heaven. He knew that. But what he knew is that when he got to heaven, he would be at the finish line, and the Lord would be pleased with his race. I have a desire that when I get to heaven, the Lord is going to look at me and say, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." I'm pretty sure it's not what he's going to say, but I'm pretty sure what he's going to say is that just because of the blood of Jesus Christ, you can come in. You know, that's going to be more like it, isn't it? But shouldn't our desire from this point forward is to run that race? To run that race in a way that would be pleasing to the Lord. And the only way that we can do that is to have a heavenly perspective. I want to close this morning with a race story. One that Elder Bernard Goins told me a number of years ago. And in his community, there was a handicapped child. I don't know all the details about it, but he could run. He was in high school. He had that much ability. But like many handicapped children, he wasn't on the track team. He wasn't fast enough. He didn't have the ability. But the coach just encouraged the young man, allowed him to work out with the track team, to be there, be part of the team. There came a particular time when there was a particular race, when the coach entered him into a race, a 440, complete circuit around the field of 440 yards, now it's 400 meters, a little bit different. But the 400-meter race, one circle around the track, almost a quarter of a mile. So the coach entered him and said, yeah, you can run this race. So he was so proud. He was so happy that he would finally get to race. And so he lined up with all of those that were expected and wanted to compete to win. The starting gun went off, and they all took off. And it was quickly obvious that this young man was not going to win first place. And the others circled the track so rapidly. And here he was, 10 yards, 20 yards, 30 yards, 40 yards, 50 yards behind. And then the rest of the pack came around and finished the race. And he was still way back here. But he kept coming. He kept running. And the crowd, who knew the situation, saw this young man 50 yards behind the winner, probably more. And so when the young man turned that last corner and came down the final straightaway, everybody in the stands were on their feet, yelling and cheering for this young man as he crossed the finish line, dead last, by far. The crowd just went crazy in encouragement. And this young man was so excited. He was so happy. He heard the crowd cheering. And he ran over to the coach. And he said, see, coach, I told you I could win. Well, isn't that how our lives should be? Cheering and encouraging one another. And in our own race, see ourselves as that young man, never giving up. Knowing he wasn't the fastest one on the track, but he had his eye on one thing, the finish line. And no matter what happened, he kept his eye there, and he finished the race. Let us be like that man. Keep your eye on the finish line. Finish the race. Finish the race. Looking unto Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith. May God bless you.